Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we travel far beyond the rise of the Anunnaki, beyond the first kings of Sumer, beyond even the oldest flood stories ever carved into stone, to a time when, according to the most ancient Mesopotamian records on Earth, humanity was still young, still wandering, still unable to write, unable to measure the stars, unable to build cities, and then something arrived. 7 beings emerging from the waters of the deep, carrying knowledge that would shape the entire future of civilization. The Sumerians called them the Apkallu, the 7 sages, mysterious figures who were said to have walked out of the Abzu, the primordial waters beneath the world, and taught humanity everything: writing, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, architecture, even the secrets of kingship itself. Now, I'll be honest with you, when I first began reading these ancient records, I assumed this was just another forgotten myth, another symbolic story from a civilization trying to explain its origins. But the deeper I went, the stranger the pattern became. Because these 7 sages do not appear only in Mesopotamia, versions of them seem to echo through ancient India, through Egypt, through Greece, and even through the mysterious watchers described in the Book of Enoch. Different cultures, different languages, thousands of miles apart, and yet somehow the same memory keeps returning. 7 ancient teachers arriving before the flood, bringing forbidden or sacred knowledge, and then disappearing. And honestly, that raises a question I haven't been able to stop thinking about. Why did so many ancient civilizations believe that knowledge was given to humanity instead of slowly discovered by humanity? Why did the people closest to the beginning of recorded history insist that civilization itself came from somewhere else? Tonight, we're not here to prove wild theories, and we're not here to force ancient myths into modern beliefs. I simply want to follow the trail left behind by these stories, carefully, quietly, like someone walking through the ruins of a city swallowed by sand long ago, searching for fragments of memory still hidden beneath the dust. Because maybe, just maybe, the ancient world was trying to preserve something far older than mythology, something remembered, but no longer fully understood. So before you get comfortable, take a gentle moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if these deep sleep history stories help you find peace, sleep better, or simply reflect on our shared journey through time. Now, close your eyes. Let the noise of the modern world drift a little farther away, and imagine yourself standing beneath the burning skies of ancient Mesopotamia, where the first city on Earth rises from the edge of the desert, and where, according to the oldest memory humanity ever wrote down, 7 figures once emerged from the water and changed the destiny of mankind forever. In the winter of 1843, long before satellites mapped the deserts of the Middle East, long before archaeologists could scan buried cities from the sky, a French consul named Paul-Émile Botta stood beneath the brutal sun of northern Mesopotamia, staring at a low mound of dust and broken stone near the village of Khorsabad. To most people, it looked like nothing, just another forgotten hill rising from the dry earth of the Ottoman Empire. But beneath that silence, beneath centuries of wind-blown sand and collapsed mud brick, an empire was sleeping. Bada did not yet know it, but he was standing above the buried remains of Dur-Sharrukin, the lost capital of the Assyrian king Sargon II, a city abandoned so suddenly and so completely that it had almost vanished from human memory altogether. I always find myself thinking about moments like this, because history rarely announces itself with certainty. Sometimes, the greatest discoveries begin with someone simply becoming curious enough to keep digging. And that is exactly what Bada did. Day after day, workers cut through packed earth beneath the burning sky, baskets of dirt hauled upward, fragments of alabaster appearing one piece at a time, until finally something emerged from the darkness that should not have existed. Massive stone reliefs, taller than a man, perfectly preserved beneath the ruins, and carved across those ancient walls staring outward with unsettling stillness, were figures unlike anything the modern world had seen before. They had the bodies of men, but the heads of birds, great curved beaks like eagles, wings folded carefully against their backs, and in their hands, every single figure carried the same strange objects: a small bucket in one hand and a pine cone in the other. The first time I saw photographs of those carvings, I remember stopping completely because they do not feel decorative. They do not feel symbolic in the simple way modern art feels symbolic. They feel deliberate, ritualistic, almost functional, as though these beings were performing a task no one alive fully understood anymore. And the strangest part is this: the Assyrians placed them everywhere that mattered most, beside royal chambers, along sacred hallways, guarding entrances, standing watch over thresholds, as though the entire empire believed these figures protected something sacred hidden inside the palace walls. Bada himself could not explain what he had found. Neither could the scholars of Europe at first, because the language of Assyria had been dead for nearly 2,000 years. Its wedge-shaped symbols unreadable, its gods forgotten, its stories buried beneath dust. Imagine that feeling for a moment, standing inside a room untouched since before the birth of Christ, surrounded by beings carved by hands that vanished from Earth 25 centuries earlier, beings who seemed to belong neither fully to man nor fully to God, and realizing no one alive could tell you who they were. There is something deeply unsettling about encountering a message from the ancient world and not possessing the key to understand it. But over the decades that followed, as cuneiform script was slowly deciphered, as more ruins emerged from beneath Mesopotamia, and as thousands upon thousands of clay tablets were translated, a name finally began to surface from the darkness: Apkallu, sometimes rendered as Abkallu, the Seven Sages. And the deeper I looked into those records, the stranger everything became. Because according to the oldest traditions of ancient Sumer, these figures were not ordinary mythological beings. They were remembered as teachers, beings who emerged from the waters before the rise of civilization itself, long before Babylon, long before Assyria, perhaps even before the earliest kings remembered in human history. The Mesopotamians believed these sages came from the Abzu, the vast freshwater deep hidden beneath the earth, the realm of the god Enki, lord of wisdom, knowledge, and creation. And these beings, according to the ancient texts, taught humanity everything: writing, mathematics, astronomy, architecture, medicine, law, even the rituals required to maintain order between heaven and earth. The more I read, the less these carvings felt like simple mythology, and the more they felt like fragments of a memory humanity refused to let die. Because here's the question that stayed with me long after I closed those books. If these figures were only symbolic, then why did the Assyrians place them at the very center of imperial power, guarding the heart of one of the greatest empires the ancient world had ever known? Why did generation after generation continue carving them into palace walls, preserving their images for centuries, as though forgetting them was dangerous? And perhaps most unsettling of all, why do they feel so strangely familiar, even now, standing silently across the gulf of nearly 3,000 years, still holding their bucket, still raising the pine cone, still watching the doorway, as though they are waiting for someone to finally remember who they were? If you travel far enough south in modern Iraq, beyond the crowded cities, beyond the oil fields and broken highways, beyond the places most tourists will ever see, eventually the land begins to flatten into something almost unreal. An endless pale horizon where earth and sky seem to dissolve into each other beneath the heat. The wind moves slowly there, carrying salt dust across the cracked ground, and for miles, almost nothing grows. It is difficult to imagine that this empty landscape was once considered the center of the world. And yet, rising quietly from that desolation, there is a low mound of eroded mud brick and ancient debris that Loltel Abufahalin. But to the Sumerians, it was something far more important. They called it Eridu, the first city on earth. Not one of the first cities, not the first city they built, but the first city. Full stop. The place where civilization itself began. I remember the first time I read those words in the Sumerian king list. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. And honestly, I could not stop thinking about that phrase, because it does not describe civilization as something humans slowly constructed through trial and error. It describes civilization as something that arrived, something handed down, almost like an inheritance from somewhere beyond the human world. The Sumerian king list itself is one of the strangest historical documents ever discovered, a long cuneiform text listing rulers before and after the Great Flood, blending mythology and history so seamlessly that even modern scholars still argue over where one ends and the other begins. At the very top of that list stands a king named Allulim, the first ruler of Eridu, said to have reigned for 28,800 years. Now, obviously, no modern historian believes Allulim literally ruled for 28,000 years. But that is not really the point. Ancient people often used impossible numbers to communicate sacred distance, to tell you that these figures belong to an age outside normal human memory. And the deeper I looked into Eridu, the more it felt exactly like that. A place standing at the edge between myth and something far older, something half remembered. In 1946, Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safar and British archaeologist Seton Lloyd began excavating the mound of Eridu systematically, carefully peeling back layers of earth that had accumulated over thousands of years. What they uncovered was astonishing. Beneath the mound, they discovered 18 separate layers of human habitation. 18 cities built on top of each other like pages in a buried book, each one older than the last, descending deeper and deeper toward the beginning of civilization itself. And at the very bottom, resting directly on untouched sand, they found something so small and yet so strangely important that I still think about it often. It was not a palace, not a grand temple, not the remains of some mighty empire. It was just a tiny mud brick room, barely larger than a modern storage closet, with fish bones scattered across the floor, and a simple niche built into one wall, likely used for offerings. That humble structure dates to around 5400 BC, older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, older than almost everything we instinctively think of as ancient history. But here is the detail that keeps pulling me back into this story. As archaeologists moved upward through the layers of Eridu, the city did not evolve chaotically. The progression was orderly, strangely orderly. Each layer became more sophisticated, more architecturally advanced, more structured than the one before it. Small shrines became larger sanctuaries. Sanctuaries became temples. Temples became organized ceremonial complexes with platforms, courtyards, buttressed walls, and systems of design that appear almost planned in advance. And that is the part that unsettles me a little, because when we imagine early civilization, we tend to imagine confusion, experimentation, people slowly figuring things out across centuries of failure. But Eridu does not entirely feel like that. It feels directed, almost as though a blueprint already existed and humanity was slowly catching up to it. I'm not saying mysterious beings literally descended from the sky carrying architecture manuals, but I understand why the Sumerians themselves began telling stories about divine teachers from the deep. Because if you were living in that world, watching cities emerge from empty land, watching mathematics, irrigation, astronomy, writing, and sacred kingship appear with astonishing speed, how else would you explain it? The Sumerians believed the god Enki lived beneath Eridu in the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater ocean hidden beneath the earth, and from that watery abyss, according to their oldest traditions, came the seven sages, the Apkallu, beings who brought humanity the arts of civilization. And standing there mentally at the edge of ancient Eridu, imagining the wind crossing the salt plains 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, I can almost understand why they believed it. Because civilization in Mesopotamia does not merely feel invented. Sometimes it feels remembered. And perhaps that is the strangest idea hidden inside all these ancient stories. Not that humans learned too quickly, but that somewhere deep in the oldest layers of memory, people believed they were rebuilding something that had already existed long before them. There is a moment when you spend enough time reading the oldest Mesopotamian records that the stories begin to feel less like mythology and more like echoes, echoes from people trying desperately to remember where their knowledge came from. And eventually, if you follow those echoes far enough, they all seem to lead back to the same place, the Abzu. The Sumerians imagined the Abzu as a vast subterranean ocean of fresh water hidden beneath the earth, an invisible realm beneath rivers, beneath deserts, beneath the foundations of cities themselves. It was not a place of chaos like later underworlds in mythology. It was a place of wisdom, creation, hidden potential, the deep source beneath reality. And ruling over this mysterious realm was Enki, perhaps one of the most fascinating gods in all of ancient history. Enki was not a god of war, not a storm god, not a king seated high above humanity demanding worship through fear. He was something quieter, stranger, almost intimate. He was the god of wisdom, craftsmanship, writing, invention, sacred knowledge, the kind of god who solved problems instead of creating them. Again and again in Mesopotamian myths, it was when the other gods wanted destruction. Enki intervened to preserve humanity. And according to the oldest traditions of Sumer, it was Enki who sent 7 beings upward from the waters of the Abzu into the human world. 7 sages known as the Apkallu, or Apkallu. The more I studied these figures, the harder they became to categorize. They are not exactly gods, not fully human either, more like intermediaries, carriers of knowledge between worlds. Some texts describe them emerging from the sea, others depict them wearing fish cloaks, and centuries later, Greek writers would remember them as strange amphibious beings who taught civilization to mankind. One of those Greek writers was Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in the 3rd century BC, long after the glory days of Sumer had already faded into dust. His original books are lost now, but fragments survived through later historians. And in those fragments, he describes a being named Oannes. According to Berossus, Oannes emerged from the waters of the Persian Gulf during the earliest days of humanity, appearing as a creature with the body of a fish, but beneath the fish's head, another human face. During the day, this being walked among humans, teaching them how to write, how to build cities, how to establish laws, how to measure the land, how to cultivate crops, and when evening came, he returned once more to the sea. The first time I encountered that story, I assumed it was simply symbolic, another ancient metaphor. But then I discovered something that genuinely unsettled me. Because when archaeologists and cuneiform scholars later deciphered Mesopotamian tablets buried beneath Nineveh and other ancient cities, they found that Berossus had not invented the tradition at all. He had preserved it. The original Sumerian figure behind Oannes appears to have been Uana, sometimes linked with Adapa, the first and greatest of the 7 sages. And according to the ancient lists, Uana was the one who completed the plans of heaven and earth. Think about that phrase for a moment. Not merely a teacher, but someone associated with the ordering of reality itself. And he was only the first. The Mesopotamian traditions speak of 7 sages before the Great Flood, each connected to one of the ancient antediluvian kings, each carrying a different aspect of sacred knowledge into the human world. Together, they were credited with giving humanity the foundations of civilization itself, writing so memory could survive beyond a single lifetime. Mathematics, especially the astonishing base 60 system that still survives today in the way we measure time and angles. Architecture, the proportions and designs used for temples and sacred cities. Agriculture, irrigation, crop cycles, the management of rivers. The more you examine the list, the stranger it becomes, because it reads less like mythology and more like a curriculum, almost as though the ancient world believed civilization had been taught systematically, step by step, discipline by discipline. And perhaps that is the deepest idea hidden beneath all these stories, the idea that knowledge was never considered accidental. Modern people tend to imagine civilization as a long chain of random discoveries, primitive humans slowly stumbling toward progress through endless trial and error. But the Sumerians saw it differently. To them, civilization appeared as a gift, something received, something handed down from a higher source. Knowledge was given. That pattern appears again and again in the oldest myths of Mesopotamia. Humans do not invent writing. they receive it. Humans do not independently create sacred laws, they are instructed in them. Even kingship itself, according to the Sumerian king list, descends from heaven. And honestly, I think this is the part modern people struggle to understand, because ancient cultures were not stupid. They knew perfectly well that humans physically built cities with their own hands. But they still believed the blueprint, the organizing intelligence, civilization, came from somewhere beyond ordinary human experience. Maybe they were speaking metaphorically. Maybe the Apkallu represented accumulated ancestral wisdom passed through generations after some forgotten catastrophe. Or maybe, somewhere deep beneath these myths, there truly existed a memory of teachers from a lost world now buried beneath time. I don't know. And the deeper I go into these stories, the less interested I become in forcing absolute answers. What fascinates me now is the persistence of the memory itself. Because for thousands of years, through floods, wars, collapsing empires, and disappearing languages, humanity kept repeating the same strange idea that before history truly began, 7 beings emerged from the waters and taught us how to become human. By the time I reached the complete lists of the Apkallu preserved in the ancient Mesopotamian tablets, I began to realize something unsettling. The 7 sages were not remembered as vague mythological symbols. They were remembered almost like a lineage, a sequence, each one tied to a king, each one tied to a sacred era before the flood, and each one entrusted with preserving a different piece of civilization itself. Their names survive today only because clay tablets buried beneath Mesopotamia endured long enough for modern archaeologists to recover them from the dust. Names written in cuneiform by scribes who vanished thousands of years ago, and yet somehow still speaking across time. The first was Uana, the great sage later remembered by the Greeks as Oans, the one said to have emerged first from the waters of the Abzu, bringing with him the plans for heaven and earth. Then came Uana described as the sage endowed with comprehensive intelligence. After him came Enmeduga, associated with destiny and sacred order, then Enmegalama, then Enmebuluga, then Enenlilda, names so ancient they almost feel like fragments of another language entirely, echoes from the childhood of civilization. And together, according to Mesopotamian tradition, these beings guided humanity through the first ages of the world, before the Great Flood reshaped history forever. What fascinates me is not only the myth itself, but the structure of the myth, because the sages are always presented sequentially, almost like stages in a transmission, knowledge passing carefully from one era to another, generation after generation, until finally everything leads to the 7th figure, Utuabzu, the last sage before the flood, the one whose story feels different from all the others. In the surviving traditions, 6 of the Apkallu eventually return to the waters of the Abzu, descending once more into the hidden deep from which they came. That alone is strange enough, these beings emerging from water, teaching humanity, then vanishing beneath the world again like tides retreating into darkness. But the 7th sage does not return downward. According to the texts, Utuabzu ascended to heaven. The first time I encountered that detail, I stopped reading completely, because suddenly, the story no longer felt isolated to Mesopotamia. It felt familiar, disturbingly familiar. A line of ancient sages before the flood, and the 7th figure is taken upward into heaven instead of disappearing like the others. I remember sitting there quietly, realizing I had seen this pattern before, not once, but many times. In the book of Genesis, Enoch is the 7th patriarch from Adam, and unlike the others, he does not die normally. He is taken by God. In later Jewish tradition, Enoch ascends into the heavens and receives divine knowledge. In the book of Enoch, that knowledge becomes connected to celestial mysteries, forbidden wisdom, the hidden structure of the cosmos itself. And then, in ancient India, another pattern emerges. The Saptarishi, 7 primordial sages associated with cosmic knowledge and sacred transmission. Again, 7 figures. Again, teachers before ordinary history. Again, a connection between humanity and higher knowledge, and knowledge descending from beyond the human world. The more I followed these patterns, the less I felt like I was studying separate mythologies and the more I felt like I was standing inside some vast network of fragmented memories, pieces of a story scattered across civilizations that no longer remembered their common origin. Of course, maybe all of this is coincidence. Maybe the human mind simply gravitates towards symbolic numbers like seven, 7 stars, 7 days, 7 visible celestial bodies in the ancient sky. But honestly, the repetition begins to feel difficult to ignore after a while, because it is not merely the number that repeats, it is the structure, 7 figures, connected to sacred knowledge, appearing before catastrophe, with the seventh somehow transcending the others. And the Mesopotamians preserved this idea with remarkable consistency across centuries of texts. The seventh sage, Abzu, was remembered not merely as wise, but as transformed, elevated, removed from the ordinary fate of humanity. There is something haunting about that image, side A, especially when you imagine these stories being told beside rivers under the night sky 5,000 years ago. Generations of people repeating the names of beings they believed had once walked among them, preserving memories of teachers from before the flood, before kingship, before written history fully began. Sometimes I wonder what those ancient storytellers actually believed, not what modern scholars think, but what the people themselves felt deep inside when they recited these traditions. Did they imagine literal beings from the waters? Did they see the Apkallu as divine messengers? Or were they trying to preserve the memory of a forgotten civilization whose knowledge seemed almost supernatural compared to the world that came after? I don't know. And perhaps the uncertainty itself is part of what makes these stories endure. Because once the pattern reveals itself, you begin seeing it everywhere, in myths, in religions, in ancient kings' lists, in stories about heavenly teachers descending to earth, bringing knowledge and then vanishing again. And somewhere along the way, I realized the story was no longer only about the 7 sages of Mesopotamia. It had become something much larger, a recurring human intuition, the persistent belief that civilization did not emerge alone, that somewhere near the beginning humanity was taught. And standing at the edge of that realization, I could feel a strange question slowly taking shape in my mind, a question that would follow me through every ancient culture I explored afterward. Why does the seventh figure always seem to cross the boundary between worlds? There is an ancient story from Mesopotamia that stayed with me longer than almost any other, not because it is loud or dramatic, but because it feels painfully human. It is the story of Adapa, the sage of Eridu, the man who was given extraordinary wisdom but denied eternal life. And the older I get, the more I think this story was never really about immortality at all. I think it was about the terrible distance between knowledge and transcendence. The myth survives only in fragments now. Broken clay tablets scattered across the ruins of the ancient world, pieces discovered in places like Nineveh and the Amarna archive in Egypt, copied and recopied across centuries by scribes who clearly believed this story mattered deeply. And perhaps they were right. Because once you begin reading it carefully, you realize it contains one of the oldest philosophical questions humanity ever asked. What if wisdom alone cannot save us from death? Dapa himself is a fascinating figure, sometimes described as human, sometimes as more than human, forever standing somewhere between priest, sage, and primordial teacher. He serves Enki, the god of wisdom, in the sacred city of Eridu beside the waters of the Abzu. Every day, Adapa performs rituals, prepares offerings, maintains the divine order connecting heaven and earth. He is loyal, disciplined, profoundly intelligent. The texts repeatedly emphasize that Enki gave Adapa immense wisdom, knowledge beyond ordinary men, but deliberately withheld one thing: immortality. And honestly, that detail changes everything, because it suggests the gods themselves drew a line humanity was never meant to cross. The story begins quietly, almost peacefully. Adapa goes out onto the waters near Eridu to fish, likely part of his sacred duties, when suddenly the south wind rises violently and overturns his boat. Enraged, Adapa does something extraordinary. He curses the wind itself, and the curse works. The wing of the south wind is broken. For 7 days, the winds cease to blow across the world. Imagine how terrifying that would have felt in the ancient world, a silence falling over nature itself as though cosmic balance had been interrupted. Eventually, the disturbance reaches the heavens, and Anu, supreme god of the sky, demands to know who dared interfere with the natural order. Adapa is summoned upward to heaven to answer for what he has done. But before he ascends, Enki calls him close and gives him a warning, and this for me is where the story becomes unforgettable. Enki tells Adapa that when he enters heaven, he will be offered bread and water by Anu, but he must refuse them. Do not eat, do not drink. Enki warns, for they are the bread of death and the water of death. So Adapa obeys. And I think this is important because throughout the story, Adapa never rebels, never seeks power, never tries to steal immortality like later heroes in myth. He trusts the wisdom given to him by the god who taught him. He ascends into heaven, mourns before its gates, earns the sympathy of its guardians, and eventually stands before Anu himself. And there, something extraordinary happens. Anu, impressed by Adapa's wisdom and humility, decides to offer him not death, but eternal life. The bread and water before him are not poison at all. They are the bread of life and the water of life, immortality itself. And Adapa refuses them. He obeys Enki's command completely, turning away the very thing humanity has desired in every civilization since the beginning of time. And when I first read that moment, I just sat there in silence for a while because the tragedy of it feels almost unbearable. A human being standing before eternity itself and unknowingly refusing it. The surviving tablets are damaged where Anu reacts. Scholars still debate the exact wording, whether he laughs, sighs, or simply expresses his disappointment. But the outcome is clear. Adapa is sent back to Earth. He keeps his wisdom, but he remains mortal forever. And honestly, I think the emotional power of this story lies in its ambiguity. Did Enki deceive him deliberately? Did the god of wisdom intentionally prevent humanity from gaining immortality? Or was Enki himself trying to protect Adapa from something dangerous, genuinely believing the bread and water would destroy him? The text never fully answers, and perhaps it was never meant to, because beneath the myth, beneath the gods and heavenly courts, there is a deeper truth the Mesopotamians seem to understand with remarkable clarity. Wisdom and immortality are not the same thing. You can understand the stars, master writing, calculate eclipses, preserve the memory of civilizations, and still remain fragile, temporary, mortal. That idea echoes through nearly every ancient tradition afterward. You can feel it in Gilgamesh wandering the world, searching desperately for eternal life, only to fail. You can feel it in Genesis, where humanity gains knowledge but loses access to the tree of life. You can feel it in Prometheus giving fire to mankind and suffering eternally for it. Again and again, ancient myths repeat the same painful pattern. Knowledge is permitted, immortality is withheld. And perhaps that is why the story of Adapa feels so strangely modern even now, because deep down we still believe wisdom should save us. We still hope that if humanity becomes intelligent enough, advanced enough, enlightened enough, we might somehow escape death itself. But the oldest stories on Earth whisper something very different. They whisper that intelligence alone was never the final answer. And somewhere beneath the stars above ancient Eridu, beside the dark waters of the Abzu, humanity's first great sage learned that lesson the hardest way possible. The deeper I went into the traditions surrounding the Apkallu, the stranger the story became, because eventually I realized these beings were not remembered merely as mystical teachers speaking in vague spiritual riddles. They were associated with practical knowledge, precise knowledge, the kind of knowledge civilizations depend on to survive. And that is the detail that keeps pulling me back into these ancient records night after night. Because myths usually explain the world emotionally, but the Apkallu traditions often speak as though someone was preserving the memory of an actual educational system, almost like a curriculum handed down at the dawn of civilization itself. According to the Mesopotamian texts, the seven sages brought humanity nearly every foundational discipline required for organized society: writing, mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, medicine, metallurgy, architecture. law. Not one isolated invention, but an entire network of interlocking knowledge appearing together. And honestly, that is what unsettles me most. Because when modern people imagine the rise of civilization, we usually picture a slow, chaotic process. Scattered tribes gradually discovering one thing after another across thousands upon thousands of years. But ancient Mesopotamia often feels different. It feels accelerated, structured, almost guided. The Sumerians themselves believed these arts were taught by the Apkallu, gifts carried upward from the Abzu by beings connected to Enki, Lord of Wisdom. Writing, for example, was not seen as a casual invention. It was sacred. Some of the earliest cuneiform tablets begin as accounting records, grain, livestock, trade, but very quickly, writing expands into astronomy, mathematics, law, medicine, and myth itself. It becomes the nervous system of civilization. And the Sumerians treated scribes almost like custodians of divine memory, because once words could survive beyond human lifetimes, knowledge itself became immortal in a way people could never be. Then there is mathematics, and this is where things become genuinely difficult to explain casually. The Mesopotamians developed the sexagesimal system, base 60 mathematics, thousands of years ago. Even now, every time you look at a clock, every time you divide an hour into 60 minutes or a circle into 360 degrees, you are still living inside the mathematical framework they created. And the more I learned about it, the more astonishing it became, because this system was not primitive at all. It was elegant, efficient, capable of extraordinary complexity. Babylonian mathematicians could solve advanced equations, calculate geometric relationships, and perform astronomical predictions centuries before many later civilizations approached similar levels of precision. One artifact in particular haunted me when I first encountered it, a small clay tablet known today as Plimpton 322, currently housed at Columbia University. At first glance, it appears unimpressive, just rows of cuneiform numbers pressed into clay nearly 4,000 years ago. But when modern mathematicians studied it carefully, they realized the tablet contains sophisticated numerical relationships corresponding to what we now call Pythagorean triples, mathematical patterns associated with the famous theorem about right triangles. The unsettling part is this: the tablet predates Pythagoras himself by more than 1,000 years. Imagine that for a moment. Advanced mathematical understanding existing in Mesopotamia long before classical Greece, quietly preserved on clay beneath desert sands. And then there is astronomy, perhaps the discipline most strongly tied to the Apkallu traditions. Mesopotamian sky watchers tracked the movements of Venus, Jupiter, Mars, Saturn with astonishing consistency. They recorded eclipses, planetary cycles, lunar patterns, and created some of the longest continuous scientific observation records in human history. Night after night, generation after generation, priests climbed temple towers to observe the heavens, preserving data across centuries. And again, according to the traditions, these sciences were not considered purely human discoveries. They were inherited wisdom, teachings originally brought by the sages from the deep. The same pattern appears in medicine. Mesopotamian healers understood surprisingly advanced herbal treatments, antiseptic compounds, diagnostic observations, and pharmaceutical preparation. Some clay tablets contain treatments using willow bark compounds that modern chemistry recognizes as chemically related to aspirin. Honey was used for wound treatment because of its antibacterial properties, though, of course, the Mesopotamians themselves explained illness through a blend of medicine, spirituality, and ritual. To them, body and soul were never fully separate. Even metallurgy enters the story. Bronze, the material that transformed the ancient world, required far more than simple fire. It demanded precise temperatures, alloy knowledge, furnace design, controlled smelting techniques, all of which appear remarkably early in Mesopotamia and surrounding regions. Ancient traditions later associated some of this knowledge directly with the Apkallu, especially the teaching of metals, craftsmanship, and technological arts. And perhaps most importantly of all, there was law and architecture. The first cities on Earth were not random collections of huts. They were organized spaces, structured around temples, irrigation systems, administrative centers, and legal authority. Sacred architecture in Mesopotamia followed proportional systems so carefully maintained that later generations copied them for centuries. The ziggurats themselves, rising in geometric layers toward the sky, almost feel like physical manifestations of ordered knowledge imposed upon chaos. The more I sat with all this, the more one question refused to leave me alone. How did the first civilization know so much, so early? I am not asking that question carelessly, and I am certainly not claiming supernatural certainty, but I understand now why ancient people themselves became convinced their knowledge came from somewhere beyond ordinary humanity. Because when they looked around at writing, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, metallurgy, law, and monumental architecture, all emerging together in the cradle of civilization, they did not see randomness. They saw inheritance, they saw memory, they saw a gift. And maybe, just maybe, that is the true meaning hidden inside the Apkallu stories. Not that fish-cloaked beings literally walked from the sea carrying books in their hands, but that humanity has always sensed something mysterious about the sudden appearance of civilization itself, as though somewhere in the deep past, someone already knew the shape of the world we were about to build. The more time I spent studying the Apkallu, the less they felt like ordinary mythological figures, and the more they began to resemble something else entirely, guardians of a forgotten system, keepers of what could almost be called sacred technology. And I know that phrase sounds strange at first, because when we hear the word technology, we usually imagine machines, circuits, engines, screens glowing in dark rooms. But ancient civilizations understood technology differently. To them, technology was any repeatable system capable of shaping reality, whether physical, spiritual, or psychological. And in Mesopotamia, the Apkallu stood at the center of those systems. If you look carefully at Assyrian carvings, especially those discovered in the ruined palaces of Nimrud and Dur-Sharrukin, you begin noticing that the Apkallu appear in several distinct forms, almost like different manifestations of the same mysterious order. The oldest and perhaps most unsettling form is the fish-cloaked sage. These figures wear the entire body of a great fish draped over themselves like ceremonial skin, the fish's open mouth resting above the human head, the tail hanging down behind their backs. The effect is deeply uncanny. Not monstrous exactly, but liminal, as though the being belongs simultaneously to two worlds. Water and land, depth and surface, hidden knowledge and visible civilization. The first time I saw one of these carvings in detail, I remember feeling something difficult to explain, because the figure did not feel primitive. It felt intentional, symbolic in a way modern people no longer fully understand. The Mesopotamians clearly wanted viewers to recognize these sages as beings connected to the deep, emissaries emerging from the Abzu itself. Then there are the human form Apkallu, calm, bearded, dressed in elaborately patterned robes, carrying themselves with a stillness that almost radiates authority. Unlike the winged warrior gods found elsewhere in Assyrian art, these figures do not project brute force. They project knowledge, presence, restraint. They stand beside kings, behind thrones, near sacred trees, as though their role was not conquest, but maintenance. Preserving balance between the human world and the divine order beyond it. And finally, there are the bird-headed Apkallu, perhaps the most iconic of all. Human bodies, eagle heads, enormous wings folded behind them, towering silently beside palace entrances. These are the figures that haunted me most when I first encountered them, because they do not merely decorate space, they watch space. They guard it. Every posture, every gesture feels ritualized, and always, in their hands, the same two objects appear again and again, a bucket and a cone-shaped object often interpreted as a pine cone. For years, scholars debated their meaning, and honestly, even now, there is no single explanation everyone agrees upon completely. The most accepted interpretation is ritual purification. The bucket, known in Akkadian as the bandudu, likely held sacred water, oils, or ritual substances, while the cone was dipped into the liquid and used to sprinkle purification over kings, sacred trees, or architectural spaces. In that interpretation, the Apkallu were cleansing, consecrating, maintaining order against spiritual corruption. But the longer I sat with those images, the stranger they became. Because why repeat the exact same ritual gesture thousands of times across palaces, temples, reliefs, and protective figurines hidden beneath buildings? Clearly, this was not decorative art. It was functional. The Assyrians believed these beings possessed protective power, a patrapaic power, the ability to ward off chaos, disease, curses, and unseen forces threatening the stability of the world. Archaeologists later discovered small clay Apkallu figurines buried beneath the foundations of Assyrian buildings, hidden beneath floors, positioned carefully at thresholds and corners according to exact ritual instructions preserved on cuneiform tablets. Imagine that for a moment. Beneath the feet of kings, servants, soldiers, entire invisible networks of protective figures lay hidden in darkness, silently guarding the structure from forces no one could physically see. And honestly, that is the moment I began thinking about the Apkallu differently. Because this was not mythology existing only in stories, this was applied belief, operational belief. The Assyrians organized physical space around these figures. They embedded them into architecture itself, almost like spiritual infrastructure. The rituals specifying their placement were astonishingly precise. The number of figurines, their orientation, their materials, even the incantations spoken during burial. This was systematic, repeatable, disciplined. In other words, technology, spiritual technology, yes, but technology nonetheless. A method for shaping the unseen world through symbolic systems. And suddenly, the bucket and pine cone no longer felt random at all. They felt like tools, instruments within a larger ritual framework humanity has mostly forgotten how to interpret. Some later speculative thinkers even connected the cone symbol to the pineal gland, the small cone-shaped structure deep within the human brain associated in mystical traditions with awakening, perception, inner illumination. Now, there is no direct Mesopotamian text proving that interpretation, and I want to be careful not to force modern ideas onto ancient cultures. But I understand why the association fascinates people, because something about the imagery feels deeply psychological, almost as though the sages were transmitting awareness itself, not merely information. Water, purification, sacred trees, enlightenment, thresholds. These motifs repeat constantly around the Apkallu, and perhaps threshold is the key word here, because that is where the sages always appear, at doorways, gateways, boundaries between one realm and another. The Assyrians did not place them randomly. They stationed them where worlds touched, interior and exterior, sacred and profane, order and chaos, threshold guardians. And the more I thought about that, the more I realized the Apkallu themselves were thresholds too, beings standing between human and divine, memory and myth, civilization and the dark unknown that existed before it. Maybe that is why their images still feel strangely powerful even now, thousands of years later, because somewhere deep inside, we recognize the archetype immediately. The guardian at the edge of knowledge, the silent figure standing between humanity and whatever waits beyond the doorway. There is one aspect of the Apkallu tradition that I think modern people often overlook, and strangely enough, it may be the most important part of the entire story. The sages were not remembered merely as mysterious beings who appeared once, delivered wisdom, and vanished into legend. According to Mesopotamian tradition, they established systems, institutions, methods of preserving knowledge long after the teachers themselves were gone. And honestly, the more I thought about it, the more I realized this might be the true beginning of civilization. Not cities, not kings, not temples, but organized learning. Because knowledge only changes history if it survives. Somewhere in the ancient cities of Sumer, beneath the shadow of temple towers, the first schools on earth began to appear. They were attached to temple complexes, because in Mesopotamia, religion, administration, astronomy, mathematics, and writing were never truly separate disciplines. The temples were not only places of worship, they were centers of memory, archives of civilization itself. And inside those temple schools, Generation after generation of students learned to preserve the knowledge the sages were believed to have brought from the deep. The Sumerians called many of these schools eduba, literally tablet houses. I love that phrase for some reason. Tablet houses, because it sounds almost humble compared to the enormous importance of what happened inside them. Small rooms filled with clay tablets, students pressing wedge-shaped signs into wet clay, teachers correcting mistakes, lists of symbols copied again and again until memory became discipline. Imagine the atmosphere there at dawn, sunlight entering through mud brick windows, the smell of wet clay, the scratching sound of styluses pressing cuneiform into tablets, boys repeating sign lists aloud while older scribes watched carefully from the corners of the room. Civilization was being transmitted line by line, symbol by symbol, one exhausted student at a time. And this is where the story becomes truly profound for me, because Mesopotamia did not merely invent writing, it invented organized preservation. Before writing, human knowledge was fragile, dependent entirely on memory, vulnerable to death, war, disaster, and forgetting. One generation lost and centuries of accumulated wisdom could disappear forever. But writing changed that. Writing allowed knowledge to survive independently of the human body, and the Sumerians understood this immediately. They treated writing almost like sacred engineering, a technology capable of defeating oblivion itself. That is why the Apkallu mattered so much, because the Mesopotamians believed the sages had not simply taught isolated facts, they had taught humanity how to preserve civilization across time. The deeper I explored these ancient schools, the more strikingly modern they began to feel. Students advanced through structured stages, beginning with simple sign lists, then administrative records, then mathematics, astronomy, legal formulas, literature, and sacred texts. Their exercises survive today by the tens of thousands, countless clay tablets filled with repeated symbols, corrections, copied hymns, calculations, fragments of stories. And what moves me most about these tablets is how human they feel. Some contain careless mistakes, smudges, frustrated repetitions, even sarcastic school dialogues complaining about strict teachers and endless assignments. 5,000 years later, you can still feel exhausted students trying desperately to master the impossible complexity of the world they inherited. In some texts, advanced scribes or learned practitioners are referred to symbolically as sons of Adapa, not literal biological descendants, but intellectual descendants, heirs to the wisdom lineage traced back to the first sage of Eridu himself. And honestly, I think this idea may be one of the greatest inventions in human history. The realization that knowledge can form a lineage stronger than blood. Think about that carefully for a moment, because modern civilization still operates on exactly the same principle. Universities, apprenticeships, mentorship, scientific traditions, professional training, all of it depends on the same foundational idea first formalized in places like Sumer, that wisdom survives only if it is deliberately passed from one mind to another. Civilization survives through transmission. The Mesopotamians seem to understand this with remarkable clarity. They knew that knowledge dies when people stop teaching it. And perhaps that fear of forgetting explains why the Apkallu traditions endured for thousands of years. The sages represented continuity, the unbroken chain stretching from the primordial world into the present. And maybe that is why the stories feel strangely emotional beneath all the mythology, because they are not only about mysterious beings from the water, they are about humanity's desperate struggle against forgetting. Every tablet copied, every lesson memorized, every student trained in the Aduba was an act of resistance against oblivion. Even now, sitting here in the modern world surrounded by digital screens and endless information, I find something deeply moving in that image. Young scribes in ancient Mesopotamia pressing symbols into wet clay so the future would remember what the past had learned. And perhaps that is the real legacy of the Apkallu, not supernatural powers, not hidden magic, but the understanding that knowledge alone is never enough. Knowledge must be preserved, organized, protected, and passed onward across generations, or civilization collapses back into silence. Maybe that is what the sages truly gave humanity, not merely facts, but the realization that memory itself must be sacred. Long before the story of Noah was written into the book of Genesis, long before biblical scribes shaped flood traditions into the form most people recognize today, the people of Mesopotamia were already whispering about a catastrophe so immense, so absolute, that it divided history itself into two worlds: the world before the flood and everything that came after. And the strange thing is, the deeper I explored these ancient stories, the less they felt like simple disaster myths, and the more they began to resemble memories of collapse, fragments from civilizations staring into the ruins of something older than themselves. In Mesopotamia, the flood story appears again and again under different names across different centuries, copied onto clay tablets by generations who clearly believed this event mattered profoundly. In one version, the survivor is Atrahasis, the exceedingly wise. In another, it is Utnapishtim, the immortal figure encountered by Gilgamesh at the edge of the world. In the oldest surviving Sumerian version, the survivor is Ziusudra, king and priest, chosen to preserve life while the waters consume civilization. Different names, slightly different details, but always the same structure. The gods decide. The gods decide humanity must be destroyed, and one figure receives a warning in secret. And almost always, the god behind that warning is Enki. I find that deeply fascinating because throughout Mesopotamian mythology, Enki repeatedly acts as the protector of humanity, the god who preserves knowledge, memory, and continuity, even when the other gods choose destruction. In the Atrahasis epic, humanity has multiplied so greatly that their noise disturbs the divine order itself. Enlil, the storm god, grows furious, demanding the destruction of mankind through plague, famine, and finally flood. But Enki cannot accept total annihilation. So instead of openly defying the divine council, he speaks indirectly through the walls of a reed house where Atrahasis sleeps, warning him secretly to dismantle his home and build a vessel large enough to survive the coming waters. There is something hauntingly intimate about that image. A god whispering through walls in the middle of the night while civilization unknowingly approaches extinction. And when the flood finally arrives, Mesopotamian texts describe it with terrifying force. The skies darken, storms rage without mercy, rivers overflow, the foundations of the world collapse beneath the violence of the waters. In some accounts, even the gods themselves become frightened by what they unleashed, retreating upward in fear while humanity disappears beneath the flood. I remember reading one line where the gods huddle together like dogs near the edges of heaven, terrified by the destruction below. And honestly, that image stayed with me for days, because unlike many later flood narratives, these Mesopotamian stories do not portray the gods as fully calm or fully in control. The flood feels chaotic, traumatic, almost irreversible. And perhaps that is because somewhere beneath the mythological language, these stories may preserve memories of real catastrophes experienced by ancient peoples living near unstable rivers and rising seas. Archaeologists have found flood layers at multiple Mesopotamian sites, including Shuruppak, the city associated with Ziusudra in Sumerian tradition. Thick deposits of water-laid sediment separate earlier human occupation layers from later rebuilding phases, as though entire settlements were abruptly interrupted by catastrophic inundation. And beyond the rivers themselves, geological evidence suggests that around 5500 BC, sea levels in the Persian Gulf region rose dramatically as glacial meltwaters reshaped coastlines. Ancient communities once living on dry land were swallowed beneath advancing waters, their settlements disappearing beneath the Gulf forever. Sometimes I wonder what surviving populations carried with them after such events, not only tools and seeds, but stories, memories, fragments of knowledge from worlds now gone beneath the sea. Because that is what makes the Mesopotamian flood traditions feel so different from simple moral tales. They are not merely about punishment, they are about preservation. Again and again, the emphasis falls not only on saving biological life, but on protecting civilization itself. Knowledge, rituals, crafts, sacred traditions, the continuity of memory across catastrophe. In some later traditions, the Apkallu themselves become connected to this preservation effort, ensuring that essential knowledge survives the collapse of the antediluvian world. And honestly, the more I thought about that, the more the flood began to feel less like the end of humanity and more like the end of a forgotten age, a civilizational reset. The destruction was not total, but enough to fracture continuity, enough that future generations would inherit fragments without fully understanding their origin anymore. Perhaps that is why the ancient world became obsessed with preserving knowledge afterward, writing it into clay, burying tablets beneath temples, training scribes to memorize traditions generation after generation. Because once you survive a catastrophe large enough to erase entire cities, forgetting becomes terrifying. The flood myths of Mesopotamia are ancient, older than the Bible, older than classical civilization itself, and yet their emotional core still feels strangely modern. Deep down, we all understand the fear hidden inside them. The fear that everything humanity builds, every city, every library, every system of knowledge, can vanish. And perhaps that is why Enki matters so much in these stories, because he represents the stubborn refusal to let memory disappear completely. Even when worlds collapse, someone must preserve the thread. Someone must carry knowledge across the waters into the next age. And maybe, just maybe, that is why the Mesopotamians remembered the Apkallu so reverently, not only as teachers, but as guardians standing between civilization and oblivion. One idea kept returning to me while I studied the ancient flood traditions of Mesopotamia, a quiet, unsettling possibility hidden beneath the myths themselves. What if the people who told these stories were not only trying to explain a catastrophe, but were trying to explain why fragments of advanced knowledge seemed to survive after it? Because the deeper I went into the old texts, the more I noticed something strange, again and again. The stories emphasize preservation, not only survival, preservation of memory, preservation of sacred sciences, preservation of civilization itself. In later Mesopotamian traditions, especially those surrounding the Apkallu, there are repeated references to repositories hidden before the flood, sealed chambers, buried tablets, knowledge protected beneath temple foundations, while the world above prepared to drown. Now, I want to be careful here because archaeology cannot prove every detail of these traditions literally happened exactly as later myths describe them. But what fascinates me is that the idea itself appears so consistently, the belief that the sages anticipated catastrophe and took deliberate steps to ensure civilization would survive it. And honestly, once I started imagining ancient people facing rising waters, imagining facing rising waters, collapsing coastlines, disappearing settlements, the instinct to preserve knowledge suddenly felt completely human. Imagine knowing your world is ending, your cities flooding, your trade routes collapsing, entire communities vanishing beneath water or mud. What would you save? Gold? Weapons? Statues? Or would you preserve the thing most difficult to rebuild once lost, knowledge itself? In some Mesopotamian accounts, the sages are described almost like guardians of accumulated wisdom, moving between the antediluvian cities before the flood, ensuring that sacred sciences, astronomical records, rituals, measurements, and teachings were hidden safely away. The details vary across texts, but the underlying theme remains remarkably consistent. Knowledge must survive even if civilizations do not. I remember reading about the buried figurines beneath Assyrian buildings, the hidden Apkallu placed under thresholds and temple foundations, and wondering if those practices reflected something older, a memory of hiding sacred objects beneath the earth so they might endure on catastrophe. Because ancient Mesopotamians buried things constantly: foundation deposits, ritual tablets, inscriptions, protective figures, all carefully sealed beneath structures almost like messages left for the future. And perhaps, in a world shaped repeatedly by floods and destruction, burying memory became a sacred act. One of the details that stayed with me most comes from traditions suggesting repositories of knowledge existed beneath temples themselves. Hidden chambers waterproofed with bitumen, filled with tablets, tools, records protected against the coming waters. Whether every detail of those stories is historically exact almost matters less to me now than the mindset they reveal. These people believed knowledge could disappear forever, and that possibility terrified them enough to ritualize preservation itself. The more I thought about it, the more ancient writing began to feel less like ordinary communication and more like a survival technology. Clay tablets were astonishingly durable compared to papyrus or parchment, especially once baked accidentally in fires or sealed beneath collapsed buildings. Entire libraries survived because cities burned. That irony haunts me sometimes. Destruction preserving memory. Without the collapse of Nineveh, without the ruins of buried temples, much of Mesopotamian civilization would have vanished completely into silence. Instead, fragments endured beneath the earth for thousands of years, waiting to be rediscovered. And perhaps that is the detail that truly unsettles me, because when archaeologists excavate these ancient sites, they are often literally recovering hidden memory from beneath the ground. Buried tablets, forgotten archives, lost sciences preserved in darkness until the modern world uncovers them again. Sometimes I wonder if the ancients themselves imagined exactly that happening. Did they believe future generations would eventually recover what had been hidden? Were they preserving memory or preparing for rediscovery? That question followed me constantly through these stories, because the flood myths increasingly felt less like endings and more like interruptions. Civilization collapses, knowledge disappears from ordinary life, centuries pass, and then fragments begin surfacing again among survivors rebuilding the world afterward. Perhaps that is why the Mesopotamians framed civilization as inherited wisdom rather than invention, because from their perspective, they were not creating knowledge from nothing. They were recovering pieces of something older. There is a haunting emotional weight to that idea. Imagine living in a world where ancient ruins already surrounded you. Broken temples older than memory. Stories about cities swallowed by water, fragments of sciences no longer fully understood, and believing your civilization was rebuilding from the remains of a forgotten age. Suddenly, the Apkallu no longer feel like fantasy creatures. They feel like symbols of continuity, embodiments of humanity's desperate refusal to let knowledge vanish completely. And honestly, I think that fear still lives inside us today, even if we rarely acknowledge it openly. Every archive, every library, every backup server, every attempt to preserve data against catastrophe is part of the same ancient instinct. We are still trying to protect memory from destruction, still afraid civilization itself is more fragile than it appears. Maybe that is why the flood stories endure so powerfully across human history, because they speak something deeper than water. They speak to the terror of forgetting, the terror that entire worlds can disappear, taking their wisdom with them, leaving future generations staring at ruins, trying desperately to reconstruct what was lost. And somewhere beneath the temples of Mesopotamia, beneath collapsed cities and layers of mud, the ancient world seemed to whisper the same warning again and again. Civilizations do not survive because they are powerful. They survive because someone remembers enough to rebuild them after the waters recede. Sometimes I try to imagine what the Persian Gulf looked like before the sea swallowed it, before ships crossed its waters, before oil fields and modern coastlines transformed the region into what we know today. Because for most of human history, the Persian Gulf was not entirely underwater at all. Thousands of years ago, during the last ice age and the long centuries that followed, much of the Gulf Basin was dry land, a vast fertile plain fed by ancient rivers flowing from Mesopotamia into the open sea. And the more I learned about that lost landscape, the more difficult it became to ignore a strange possibility lingering beneath the flood myths of the ancient world. What if part of humanity's oldest memory was not only about symbolic destruction, but about an actual homeland that disappeared beneath rising waters? During the late Pleistocene and early Holocene periods, global sea levels were dramatically lower than they are today because enormous quantities of water remained locked inside continental ice sheets. The Persian Gulf Basin would have formed a broad habitable region crossed by river systems filled with freshwater marshes, hunting grounds, and fertile land capable of supporting human communities long before the rise of historical Sumer. Then, slowly at first, the ice began melting. Sea levels rose across the planet over thousands of years. But in geological terms, the transformation happened astonishingly fast. Coastlines vanished, valleys flooded, entire ecosystems disappeared beneath advancing water. By around 6,000 to 5,000 BC, much of the Gulf Basin had submerged completely. And honestly, the first time I truly understood the scale of that transformation, I just sat there quietly for a while, imagining generations of people watching the sea move inland year after year, swallowing familiar land piece by piece, villages abandoned, sacred places lost, graves disappearing beneath salt water, memories becoming stories. Modern underwater archaeology in the Persian Gulf remains extremely difficult. Political tensions, harsh environmental conditions, deep sediment, and industrial activity complicate excavation enormously. But despite those challenges, scattered discoveries along the Gulf Coast hint at something remarkable. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of surprisingly organized prehistoric settlements around the edges of the Gulf region, sites with advanced fishing techniques, long-distance trade, carefully constructed homes, and signs of social coordination far older than many people expect. Some researchers even propose that the Gulf Oasis may have functioned as a kind of population refuge during periods when surrounding deserts became less habitable, a concentrated cradle of early human development hidden beneath what is now open sea. Of course, no serious archaeologist claims Atlantis lies beneath the Persian Gulf. And I think it is important to remain grounded in evidence rather than fantasy. But what fascinates me is how closely the geological reality aligns emotionally with the flood memories preserved in Mesopotamian tradition. Ancient people in this region really did witness rising seas, disappearing coastlines, and catastrophic environmental transformation across generations. And when survivors eventually moved inland towards southern Mesopotamia, carrying their traditions with them, those memories may have fused naturally with mythology, becoming the flood stories later written into clay tablets. The more I thought about it, the more the ancient world began to feel haunted by what I can only describe as the memory of a lost coast. Because flood myths are rarely just about water, they are about displacement, exile, the unbearable realization that home itself can vanish. Imagine survivors moving northward into the river plains of Mesopotamia, carrying fragments of older traditions, astronomical observations, fishing technologies, navigational knowledge, perhaps even stories about teachers from the sea who once guided their ancestors in the drowned lands of the Gulf Basin. Suddenly, the Apkallu emerging from the waters no longer feel entirely abstract. They begin to resemble cultural memory transformed into sacred narrative. And perhaps that is why the sages are so often associated with the sea, with fish cloaks, that with the deep waters of the Abzu, because the sea itself had become both origin and destroyer, giver of civilization, and eraser of worlds. Some archaeologists point out that early Sumerian cities appeared with surprising speed. Once settled life intensified in southern Mesopotamia, irrigation, temple systems, organized labor, long-distance trade, mathematical accounting, all emerging in relatively compressed periods compared to earlier prehistory. Again, I am not claiming supernatural intervention, but I understand why ancient people themselves perceived civilization as inherited knowledge rather than gradual invention. If migrating survivors carried generations of accumulated memory from now submerged coastal communities into Mesopotamia, then the rise of Sumer may indeed have felt like rebuilding rather than beginning, reconstructing rather than discovering. And honestly, that possibility moves me more than any extreme theory ever could, because it makes the ancient myths feel painfully human. Not stories invented out of ignorance, but stories born from trauma, displacement, and the desperate effort to preserve identity after the destruction of an entire world. Maybe that is why flood myths persist across cultures separated by oceans and millennia, because somewhere deep in humanity's collective memory, we remember what it feels like to lose the ground beneath us. And perhaps beneath the waters of the Persian Gulf, beneath layers of sediment and darkness untouched for thousands of years, fragments of those forgotten communities still remain, silent witnesses to a world that vanished so completely it survived only as myth. After the waters receded, after the storms faded into silence, after the old coastlines disappeared beneath rising seas and the river plains settled beneath layers of mud, humanity faced a terrifying question. How do you rebuild a world once it has been broken badly enough to forget itself? The more I studied the ancient traditions of Mesopotamia, the more I realized the flood stories were never truly about endings. They were about what comes afterward. Survival alone was not enough. The survivors had to reconstruct meaning, reconstruct memory, reconstruct civilization itself from whatever fragments remained. And honestly, that process may have shaped the entire psychology of the ancient world. Imagine emerging from catastrophe into a landscape transformed beyond recognition. Villages gone, sacred places drowned, trade routes severed, generations of accumulated knowledge fragmented into scattered memories carried by refugees moving inland. The old world survives only in stories now, in half-remembered rituals, in symbols whose original meaning grows dimmer with each passing generation. And yet, somehow, civilization begins again. Slowly, carefully, almost like someone assembling broken pieces of a shattered mirror. In southern Mesopotamia, settlements began growing larger, more organized, more interconnected. Villages became towns, towns became temple centers became the first true cities of Sumer. Eridu, Uruk, Lagash, names that would eventually stand at the beginning of recorded history itself. But the more I looked at the rise of Sumer, the less it felt like humanity starting from nothing. It felt like reconstruction, because Sumer appears in history astonishingly sophisticated, and irrigation systems already functioning, temples already central, mathematics already emerging, administrative systems already organized enough to manage labor, grain, trade, astronomy, and ritual. Civilization seemed to reappear carrying memory inside it. And perhaps that is exactly how the Sumerians themselves understood it. They did not describe civilization as invention, they described it as restoration, the return of divine order after chaos. The Apkallu, the sages from before the flood, became symbolic bridges between the lost world and the rebuilt one. According to later Mesopotamian traditions, the sages taught humanity once before the flood, and their knowledge survived into the post-flood age through carefully preserved transmission. Whether through hidden tablets, temple traditions, priestly lineages, or oral memory, something endured. And honestly, I think that possibility explains why ancient people treated knowledge with such reverence. To them, wisdom was fragile. Civilization itself was fragile. One catastrophe, one flood collapse, and everything could disappear again. The rise of Sumer after the flood myths almost feels like humanity trying desperately not to lose the thread a second time. Writing becomes central, not merely for administration, but for memory. Temples become repositories, not merely for worship, but for preservation. Schools emerge not merely to educate, but to ensure continuity across generations. Every aspect of Mesopotamian civilization seems shaped by the fear of forgetting. And perhaps that is why their myths carry such emotional weight even now, because beneath all the gods and symbols, they are stories about human beings rebuilding meaning after devastation. There is one image I cannot stop returning to. A group of survivors standing beside the rivers of southern Mesopotamia after generations of displacement, carrying fragments of older knowledge into a new land, trying to reconstruct astronomy from memory, reconstruct rituals from damaged traditions, reconstruct architecture from stories about drowned cities their grandparents once described. Maybe that is why the earliest civilizations often seem simultaneously brilliant and haunted, because they were born from remembrance as much as this discovery. The Sumerians inherited fragments, and from those fragments, they rebuilt a world. Sometimes I think modern people underestimate how much ancient cultures lived in the shadow of catastrophe. We often imagine progress as linear civilizations steadily advancing forward. But the ancient world understood something more unsettling. Collapse is always possible. Knowledge can vanish. Cities can disappear. Entire ages can sink beneath water or sand until only myth remains. And perhaps that is why the Mesopotamians preserved flood traditions so carefully, not because they were obsessed with destruction, but because they were obsessed with continuity. They wanted future generations to remember that civilization itself had once nearly vanished. The more I reflected on all this, the more one thought began following me quietly through every ancient story I encountered afterward. Maybe myths are what memory becomes after catastrophe. Maybe myths are not primitive attempts at science, nor literal historical records exactly, but emotional containers carrying fragments of truth across impossible stretches of time. Because trauma changes memory. Details blur, symbols replace facts. Sacred figures emerge where ordinary people once stood, but the emotional core survives. Loss survives. Fear survives. The memory of a drowned world survives. And perhaps somewhere beneath the flood myths of Mesopotamia, beneath the stories of Atrahasis, Ziusudra, Utnapishtim, and the Seven Sages, there really does linger a human memory so ancient it can no longer speak in ordinary language. A memory of rising waters, shattered civilizations, and survivors struggling to carry the light of knowledge into a darkened new age. And honestly, when I think about possibility, these ancient stories no longer feel distant to me at all. They feel painfully familiar, because even now, in our own fragile civilization, we are still trying to preserve memory against the fear that one day everything we built could disappear too. At a certain point in this journey, after weeks spent buried in Mesopotamian tablets, flood myths, and the strange traditions surrounding the Apkallu, I began noticing something I could no longer dismiss as coincidence. The same pattern, or at least something hauntingly close to it, kept appearing in civilizations separated by enormous distances. Cultures with different languages, different gods, different histories, and yet somehow they all seem to remember 7 primordial figures connected to wisdom, sacred knowledge, and the ordering of civilization itself. And nowhere did that pattern feel more striking to me than in ancient India, in the traditions surrounding the Saptarishi, the 7 sages. The first time I encountered the parallels seriously, I remember feeling an almost physical pause in my thoughts, because suddenly Mesopotamia no longer seemed isolated. The pattern was spreading outward, echoing through another ancient civilization thousands of miles away. In Hindu tradition, the Saptarishi are 7 great seers, primordial sages associated with divine wisdom, sacred sciences, spiritual knowledge, and the transmission of cosmic order into the human world. Their names vary slightly across texts and eras, but their role remains remarkably consistent. They stand at the beginning of human civilization as bearers of higher understanding, not conquerors, not kings, teachers. And honestly, that detail matters deeply to me, because the ancient world repeatedly places wisdom at the foundation of civilization. Not violence, not empire, wisdom. The Saptarishi are said to possess knowledge of astronomy, rituals, mathematics, cosmology, ethics, meditation, the structure of reality itself. In later Hindu thought, they become associated with the Vedas, the sacred body of revealed knowledge underlying much of Indian spiritual tradition. Again, we encounter the same unsettling idea we saw in Mesopotamia. Knowledge is not merely invented, it is received, transmitted, carried from a higher source into the human world through intermediary figures. And then there is the sky itself, because in Indian tradition, the Saptarishi are linked directly to the 7 bright stars of the constellation we now call Ursa Major, the Big Dipper. Night after night, year after year, ancient people looked upward and saw the 7 sages watching over the world from the heavens. I find that image profoundly beautiful somehow, because it transforms wisdom into something eternal, fixed among the stars, surviving long after civilizations rise and fall beneath them. But it is also the parallel itself that unsettles me, because the Apkallu traditions contain similar celestial associations, sacred knowledge descending from beyond the ordinary human realm, often linked to cosmic order, astronomical observation, and divine instruction. Different cultures, different symbols, and yet the same structural memory appears again. 7 primordial teachers, sacred sciences, civilization emerging through transmission rather than isolated discovery. The more I sat with those similarities, the harder they became to ignore completely. Of course, I understand the scholarly caution here, and I think it is important not to force simplistic conclusions. Ancient civilizations influenced one another constantly through migration, trade, conquest, and cultural exchange. Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley were not isolated worlds. Archaeological evidence shows trade connections existed between them thousands of years ago. So some similarities may reflect real contact between cultures rather than mysterious hidden origins. But honestly, even after accounting for cultural diffusion, something about the emotional structure of these traditions still feels deeper than ordinary borrowing, because the core intuition remains remarkably similar. Civilization begins when wisdom enters the human world through enlightened intermediaries. In Mesopotamia, the Apkallu emerged from the waters of the Abzu carrying sacred knowledge. In India, the Saptarishi preserve cosmic law and divine sciences. In both traditions, the sages exist near the beginning of human order itself, close to the boundary between mythic time and recorded civilization. And perhaps most intriguingly, both traditions connect wisdom with astronomy. That detail stayed with me constantly because astronomy was never merely academic for ancient civilizations. The stars regulated agriculture, ritual calendars, navigation, kingship, sacred timing, entire systems of social organization. To understand the heavens was to understand order itself. Maybe that is why so many ancient cultures imagined their first teachers as connected to the sky, because celestial patterns were among the few eternal things human beings could observe reliably across generations. Floods came, kingdoms collapsed, coastlines disappeared, but the stars remained. And perhaps somewhere in those ancient observations, wisdom itself became associated with permanence. The seven sages in the sky, watching silently while civilizations below forgot and remembered themselves again. Sometimes I wonder if these stories survived because they answered a question every civilization eventually confronts. Where did all this knowledge come from? How did human beings move from scattered survival into mathematics, astronomy, architecture, philosophy, sacred law? The ancient world did not always answer that question with human invention alone. Again and again, it imagined wisdom arriving from somewhere beyond ordinary life through teachers, sages, divine messengers, culture bearers standing at the threshold between humanity and the cosmos. And the more I followed that pattern across civilizations, the more difficult it became to dismiss the possibility that myths preserve something more than fantasy. Maybe not literal history in the modern sense, but memory, emotional memory, civilizational memory, fragments of humanity's oldest attempt to explain the sudden emergence of ordered knowledge in a chaotic world. Because once you notice the pattern of the seven sages, it begins appearing everywhere, like stars emerging slowly in the darkness once your eyes finally adjust to the night. The deeper I followed this pattern of ancient sages across civilizations, the more often my path seemed to lead toward Egypt, toward the land of the Nile, where stone temples still rise from the desert like fragments of another age, refusing to disappear completely. And honestly, Egypt unsettled me in a very different way than Mesopotamia did, because Mesopotamia feels fragile, buried, fractured, while Egypt feels impossibly permanent, as though it was designed to survive time itself. But beneath the pyramids, beneath the pharaohs, beneath the dynasties, every schoolbook teaches us about, there exists another layer of Egyptian tradition far older, stranger, and much more mysterious. A memory of rulers before kingship, beings who governed before the first human dynasties began. The ancient Egyptians referred to some of these primordial figures as the Shemsu Hor, often translated as the followers of Horus. And the first time I encountered that phrase seriously, I remember feeling the exact same sensation I felt reading about the Apkallu, that strange moment when mythology begins sounding less like fantasy and more like the distant echo of remembered origins. According to later Egyptian traditions, the Shemsu Hor existed before the dynastic age, before the unification of Egypt, before the reign of the earliest pharaohs. Historians can confidently identify today. They were described not merely as kings, but as semi-divine rulers, connected to sacred knowledge, cosmic order, and the transmission of civilization itself. Again, the pattern appears. Before ordinary kingship, there are enlightened or divine beings who establish order in the human world. The farther back Egyptian king lists extend, the stranger they become. One of the most fascinating examples is the Turin king list, a damaged papyrus compiled during the reign of Ramesses II, now broken into fragments, but still containing extraordinary details about Egypt's conception of its own ancient past, before the historical dynasties, before Menes, before the kings modern archaeology can place within established chronology. The Turin canon lists divine rulers, gods and semi-divine beings ruling Egypt for impossibly long periods of time. First the gods themselves, then the Shemsu-Hor, then eventually human kings. And honestly, the structure is astonishingly similar to Mesopotamian traditions surrounding the antediluvian sages and primordial kings. In both civilizations, ordinary human history begins only after a much older sacred age has already passed away. Modern scholars generally interpret these traditions symbolically, representations of cosmic authority, mythological legitimization for later dynasties, and I understand why. But emotionally, the stories carry something deeper. They feel like civilizations trying to preserve continuity with an older source of order, a sacred beginning they feared losing contact with. The Egyptians believed civilization depended on maintaining Maat, the divine principle of balance, harmony, truth, and cosmic stability. Before kingship became political, it was spiritual. The pharaoh's role was not simply to rule people, but to maintain cosmic order itself, to keep chaos from swallowing the world. And according to Egyptian memory, that sacred order did not originate with ordinary humans. It descended from the primordial age of divine rulers before the dynasties. The more I sat with that idea, the more I noticed parallels with the Apkallu traditions of Mesopotamia. In both cultures, civilization begins not through conquest, but through transmission. Wisdom, ritual, architecture, astronomy, sacred law, all emerge through figures standing between the human world and the divine realm. Even monumental architecture itself carries the same feeling. The pyramids, the temple alignments, the astronomical precision embedded in Egyptian sacred spaces, all contribute to the unsettling impression that ancient civilizations possessed an extraordinary relationship with cosmic order. And again, I am not claiming supernatural intervention or impossible technology. What fascinates me is something subtler, the ancient conviction that civilization must align itself with something eternal, something beyond temporary human power. The Shemsu-Hor represent that principle beautifully. They stand at the threshold between myth and history, divine order and earthly kingship, just as the Apkallu stand between the Abzu and human civilization. Sometimes I wonder whether these recurring traditions emerged because ancient societies genuinely inherited fragments of older cultural memory, memories so ancient that later civilizations transformed them into sacred myth. Or perhaps human beings simply cannot imagine civilization emerging without teachers, without wise predecessors, without some guiding intelligence standing at the beginning of things. Either way, the pattern persists. Primordial sages, divine rulers, sacred sciences, cosmic order before ordinary kingship. Even the Egyptian obsession with preserving knowledge through stone inscriptions, temple archives, funerary texts, and astronomical alignments echoes the same fear we encountered in Mesopotamia, the fear that civilization can collapse if memory dies. And perhaps that is why Egypt feels so eternal even now, because its entire civilization was built around resisting forgetting. Sometimes late at night, when I think about these ancient traditions side by side, Mesopotamia, India, Egypt, I begin to feel as though humanity has been trying to tell itself the same story for thousands of years, using different symbols and different names. A story about a sacred beginning, about wisdom descending into the human world, about civilizations struggling to preserve fragments of that original order after catastrophe and time slowly eroded away, and standing beneath the shadow of Egypt's oldest myths, long before the pharaohs we remember today. I cannot shake the feeling that the ancients themselves believed civilization was not merely built, it was inherited. At some point during this journey, after tracing the seven sages through Mesopotamia, after following their echoes into India and Egypt, I eventually arrived at a text so strange, so unsettling, that for a long time I avoided speaking about it directly, not because it was unbelievable, but because it felt too familiar. The Book of Enoch, a book once known throughout parts of the ancient world, quoted by early Jewish and Christian writers, yet later excluded from most biblical canons, surviving fully only in Ethiopian tradition while fragments slept for centuries among the Dead Sea Scrolls. And buried within its pages, there exists another version of the same ancient pattern: heavenly beings descending to humanity, bringing forbidden knowledge, and changing civilization forever. But this time, the story carries a very different emotional tone. In Mesopotamia, the Apkallu were often remembered as sacred teachers, guardians of civilization, wisdom bearers sent from Enki and the waters of the Abzu. Their gifts, writing, mathematics, architecture, sacred sciences, were largely portrayed as necessary foundations of human order. But in the Book of Enoch, knowledge itself becomes dangerous, corrupting, catastrophic. The beings at the center of this tradition are known as the Watchers, angels or heavenly entities who descend to earth during the earliest ages of humanity. According to the text, 200 watchers came down upon Mount Hermon under the leadership of figures like Semjaza and Azazel, crossing a boundary they were never meant to cross. And what fascinates me most is not only their descent, but what they taught. Because once again, we encounter the same categories of knowledge appearing across civilizations: metallurgy, astronomy, medicine, hidden sciences, celestial calculations, sacred arts. The parallels are impossible not to notice. Azazel, in particular, is blamed for teaching humanity the working of metals, weapons, ornaments, and cosmetic arts. Other watchers teach astrology, root cutting, enchantments, knowledge of the heavens and the movement of the stars. Humanity receives advanced knowledge from beings connected to the divine realm, just as in Mesopotamian tradition. But the interpretation has inverted completely. In Enoch, this transmission is not viewed as a sacred gift. It is viewed as a transgression against cosmic order. And honestly, that contrast haunted me the first time I realized it, because suddenly, two ancient civilizations were preserving remarkably similar structures, but assigning opposite moral meaning to them. Mesopotamia says the sages elevated humanity. Enoch says the watchers corrupted humanity. Same pattern, different conclusion. And perhaps that difference reveals something profound about how ancient cultures understood civilization itself. In Mesopotamia, order, cities, writing, and kingship were celebrated as divine inheritance. Civilization was sacred because it reflected cosmic wisdom descending into the human world. But in Enoch, civilization carries suspicion. Knowledge becomes entangled with violence, pride, corruption, forbidden power. Metallurgy no longer represents progress, it becomes the source of weapons and bloodshed. Astronomy becomes associated not only with wonder, but with dangerous hidden secrets. The Watchers teach humanity too much, too quickly, and the result is catastrophe. According to the Book of Enoch, the corruption unleashed by the Watchers contributes directly to the destruction of the world through the Great Flood. Once again, flood follows forbidden knowledge. That detail stopped me in my tracks when I first connected it back to Mesopotamia, because now the ancient flood traditions seemed to contain two competing memories about the same fundamental event. One tradition remembers divine teachers preserving civilization. The other remembers heavenly beings violating boundaries and bringing dangerous knowledge into the human world. And somewhere between those two visions, humanity itself becomes caught in the middle. I think that is why the Book of Enoch feels so emotionally powerful, because beneath all its apocalyptic imagery, it wrestles with a question we still struggle with today. Is knowledge always good? Or can certain knowledge destroy civilizations if humanity is not ready for it? Ancient people clearly understood that knowledge transforms societies, sometimes violently. Metalworking creates tools, but also swords. Astronomy creates calendars, but also systems of power. Writing preserves wisdom, but also enables empire, bureaucracy, and control. Perhaps the Enoch tradition reflects an ancient anxiety about the double-edged nature of civilization itself. And honestly, the older I get, the harder it becomes to dismiss that anxiety entirely. Because even now, modern humanity lives surrounded by forms of knowledge powerful enough to reshape or destroy entire worlds. Technology advances faster than wisdom, just as ancient myths feared it might. Maybe that is why the Watchers continue haunting the imagination after thousands of years, because they represent the terrifying possibility that humanity can receive power without moral readiness. But what unsettles me most is how close the Watchers still feel to the Apkallu. Both descend from beyond the human realm, both teach sacred sciences, both become linked to pre-flood civilization, both stand at the boundary between humanity and higher knowledge. And once again, the same strange pattern emerges across cultures separated by geography and theology. The more I followed these stories, the less they felt isolated, and the more they felt like fragments of an ancient conversation humanity has been having with itself since the beginning of civilization. A conversation about wisdom, power, memory, and the dangerous price of knowledge. Sometimes late at night, when I sit quietly with these texts open beside each other, Mesopotamian tablets, fragments of Enoch, ancient king lists, I begin wondering if perhaps the ancients were all struggling to describe the same terrifying realization that civilization itself changes the human soul. And maybe that is why so many traditions place mysterious teachers at the beginning of history. Because deep down, humanity has never fully decided whether the knowledge we inherited was a blessing or a burden. The deeper I followed these ancient traditions across Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, and the strange shadowlands surrounding the Book of Enoch, the more one detail kept returning with almost unbearable persistence. Not just seven sages, not just primordial teachers, but specifically the seventh one, again and again across civilizations, separated by deserts, mountains, languages, and centuries. The seventh figure seems different from the others, elevated somehow, transformed, crossing the boundary between worlds. And honestly, once I noticed that pattern, I could no longer stop seeing it everywhere. In Mesopotamian tradition, the seventh sage before the flood is Abzu, the final Apkallu connected to the antediluvian age, unlike the others who return to the waters of the Abzu after completing their mission among humanity. Abzu ascends to heaven. That detail may seem small at first, almost easy to overlook among all the flood myths and divine kings, but the moment I encountered it beside other ancient traditions, something inside me paused. Because in the biblical lineage before the flood, Enoch is also the seventh figure from Adam. And just like Abzu, Enoch does not die like ordinary men. According to Genesis, Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Such a brief line, and yet perhaps one of the strangest in the entire Bible. The text offers almost no explanation, only the image of a man who somehow crosses beyond the normal human fate. Later traditions, especially the Book of Enoch, expand this mystery dramatically. Enoch ascends into heaven, receives hidden cosmic knowledge, learns the secrets of the stars, witnesses the structure of creation itself, and becomes a mediator between worlds. Once again, the seventh figure becomes associated with transcendence, sacred wisdom, and ascent beyond mortality. And perhaps what unsettled me most was not simply the similarity, but the structure itself. Why seven? Why does the final figure repeatedly stand apart from the others? Why do so many cultures preserve the image of a seventh sage who crosses some invisible threshold ordinary humans cannot? At first, I tried dismissing it as symbolic coincidence. Seven is a sacred number in many traditions, after all. Seven visible celestial bodies, 7 days, 7 directions in some cosmologies, 7 stars in the Big Dipper. Human beings naturally attach meaning to repeating patterns, but the deeper I went, the harder the parallels became to ignore entirely. Because it is not only the number that repeats, it is the narrative shape. A lineage of wisdom bearers, ancient teachers connected to sacred knowledge, and then the seventh figure transcends the ordinary human condition. The pattern appears almost like an echo surviving across fragmented civilizations. And honestly, I began wondering whether ancient people themselves noticed these similarities, or whether they emerged independently from something deeply rooted in human psychology. Perhaps civilizations instinctively organize memory through symbolic structures, turning wisdom traditions into sacred sequences. Or perhaps, somewhere far back in forgotten prehistory, there really did exist older stories whose fragments spread across cultures long before written history separated them into different mythologies. I don't know. And I think part of me has stopped searching for simple answers altogether. What fascinates me now is the emotional persistence of the pattern itself, because the seventh figure always seems connected to transition, the crossing point between worlds, between mortality and transcendence, between civilization and the divine source of knowledge. In Mesopotamia, Abzu ascends after the age before the flood ends. In Enoch, the seventh patriarch witnesses heavenly mysteries before the destruction of the world through the flood. Even in later mystical traditions, ascending sages often become guardians of hidden wisdom preserved across catastrophe. It is almost as though the seventh figure functions as a bridge, carrying memory from one age into another. And perhaps that idea explains why these stories survived so long, because civilizations feared rupture. They feared losing continuity, losing connection with the sacred origins of knowledge itself. The seventh sage becomes the assurance that memory survives beyond collapse, that wisdom is not entirely erased when worlds end. Sometimes late at night, when I sit quietly reading these ancient texts beside each other, fragments of Mesopotamian king lists, lines from Genesis, passages from Enoch, I feel a strange sensation difficult to explain, as though I am not studying isolated religions anymore, but listening to humanity trying to remember something through broken mirrors. Different cultures preserving distorted reflections of the same underlying intuition. That wisdom came from beyond ordinary humanity, that civilization inherited something sacred, and that certain figures stood at the threshold between worlds carrying memory across catastrophe. Maybe that is why the seventh sage matters so much. Because the seventh figure represents survival beyond destruction, continuity beyond collapse, transcendence beyond ordinary history. Or maybe, um, more simply, ancient people understood something we still struggle to accept today, that wisdom alone is never enough unless someone carries it forward into the next age. And honestly, the older I become, the more I suspect these stories endure, not because ancient people were naive, but because they were wrestling with questions we still have not answered. Where does wisdom truly come from? Why does civilization rise so suddenly and collapse so repeatedly? And why, across cultures that should have remained completely separate, do we keep preserving the same mysterious structure, seven sages, seven teachers, and always, somehow, the seventh one who ascends? There is a feeling that begins to emerge after spending enough time inside the myths of the ancient world. A quiet sadness running beneath the stories, as though humanity is remembering not only wisdom, but loss. And nowhere did I feel that more strongly than when I encountered the Era epic, one of the strangest and most haunting texts to survive from Mesopotamia. Because unlike the earlier traditions that speak of the Apkallu as sacred teachers bringing civilization into the world, the Era epic speaks about what happened after they were gone. It speaks about absence, decline, the slow unraveling of order once the sages disappeared from human life. And honestly, reading it felt less like studying mythology and more like listening to a civilization mourning the memory of a lost golden age. The Era epic survives in damaged Akkadian tablets copied during the first millennium BC, long after the glory of early Sumer had already faded into antiquity. The story itself centers around Era, a god associated with war, destruction, plague, and chaos, a restless divine force embodying the violence always waiting beneath civilization's fragile surface. In the text, Era seeks to disturb the cosmic balance, and gradually, even the great god Marduk becomes persuaded to withdraw from the world temporarily. But buried within the epic is a detail that stopped me completely the first time I read it, because during the disruption of cosmic order, Marduk sends away the Apkallu, the sages The ancient wisdom bearers connected to the earliest ages of civilization are banished from the human world. In some interpretations, they are sent back into the depths of the Abzu, uh, removed from ordinary human society altogether. And after their departure, something changes. The world begins to decline. Order weakens, violence spreads, sacred balance collapses, civilization itself becomes unstable. The text never says it in simple modern language, but emotionally, the message feels unmistakable. Humanity lost something essential when the sages disappeared. The world became lesser. That phrase kept echoing in my mind while I studied these stories because once you notice it, you begin finding the same emotional structure almost everywhere in ancient mythologies. Nearly every civilization preserves some version of a lost golden age, a distant era when humanity lived closer to divine wisdom, when knowledge was greater, when order was stronger, before corruption, violence, and forgetfulness overtook the world. In Mesopotamia, the Apkallu belonged to that earlier age. Their disappearance marks the beginning of decline. And honestly, I think ancient people felt this very deeply. We often imagine the ancient world as primitive, assuming people believed history moved upward toward improvement. But many ancient civilizations believed exactly the opposite. They believed the past had been greater than the present, that humanity was living among the ruins of diminished memory. The Greeks spoke of the ages of man, descending from gold into iron. Hindu tradition describes vast cycles where spiritual understanding gradually decays over time. Even in Genesis, humanity falls away from Eden into mortality, exile, and labor. Again and again, ancient cultures preserve the same haunting intuition: something precious was lost near the beginning. And perhaps that is why the disappearance of the sages feels so emotionally important in Mesopotamian tradition, because the Apkallu symbolized continuity with that older, sacred order. As long as the sages remained close to humanity, civilization retained alignment with divine wisdom. But once they vanished, humanity was left alone with fragments, rituals without full understanding, sciences disconnected from their original source, memories slowly fading into myth. The more I reflected on this, the more I began wondering whether the stories about the sages disappearing were actually describing something profoundly human: the gradual loss of civilizational memory over generations. Imagine surviving catastrophe, rebuilding cities, preserving pieces of ancient knowledge, but slowly losing the deeper context that once gave those traditions meaning. Over centuries, memory fractures. Sacred sciences become rituals. Rituals become symbols. Symbols become myths. Eventually, people remember that wisdom once existed, but no longer fully understand it themselves. Maybe that is why so many ancient texts feel haunted by nostalgia. Not nostalgia for childhood or personal happiness, but nostalgia for a lost order older than recorded history. A memory of a world where humanity still felt connected to the source of wisdom itself. And honestly, I think that feeling still exists today, even if we rarely express it openly. Modern civilization often assumes progress is inevitable, but beneath that confidence, there is also fear. Fear that we have become disconnected from something essential, that technological advancement without wisdom leaves humanity spiritually adrift. The ancient world expressed that anxiety through myths about vanished sages, lost golden ages, sacred knowledge withdrawn from humanity after catastrophe and corruption. The era epic captures this beautifully, because the danger is not merely destruction, the true danger is abandonment. The sages leave, and humanity must continue without them. Civilization survives, but diminished, unstable, vulnerable to forgetting. Sometimes late at night, when I think about those stories, I imagine the people who copied the era epic onto clay tablets thousands of years ago. Empires had already risen and fallen around them, cities destroyed, libraries burned, ancient traditions fading. Perhaps they truly believed they were living in a lesser age than the ancestors who came before them. Perhaps the Apkallu represented not literal beings, but the unbearable human intuition that wisdom itself is fragile, and once lost, can never be fully recovered again. And maybe that is why the memory of the sages endured for so long, because deep down, Humanity never stopped grieving the feeling that something sacred disappeared from the world long ago, leaving us to rebuild civilization from fragments while trying desperately to remember what had once made it whole. One of the strangest realizations I had during this entire journey came slowly, almost quietly, after weeks spent reading flood myths, king lists, broken tablets, and stories about vanished sages from worlds swallowed by time. I began to understand that ancient knowledge did not survive because civilizations were stable. It survived because generation after generation of human beings refused to let it disappear completely. Empires collapsed, cities burned, languages died, libraries turned to ash, and yet somehow fragments endured. The thread was never fully broken. And honestly, I think that long chain of transmission may be one of the greatest miracles in human history. Because when you look carefully, the memory of the ancient world did not travel through time in a straight line. It survived through ruins, migrations, translations, accidents, obsessions, and people who dedicated their entire lives to preserving texts they barely understood themselves. One of the most extraordinary examples of this appears in the library of Ashurbanipal, buried beneath the ruins of Nineveh. Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria in the 7th century BC, was not only a conqueror, he was a collector of memory. Unlike many rulers of the ancient world, he prided himself on literacy, on his ability to read difficult Sumerian and Akkadian texts from centuries long before his own reign. And under his command, scribes gathered tablets from across Mesopotamia, preserving myths, astronomical records, rituals, medical texts, omen literature, mathematics, flood stories, and ancient wisdom traditions connected to the Apkallu themselves. Sometimes I try to imagine those shelves filled with clay tablets, thousands upon thousands of them, stacked inside palace rooms while the Assyrian Empire stood at the height of its power. And then, in 612 BC, Nineveh fell. The city burned, walls collapsed, the empire shattered beneath invasion and war. But here is the strange irony that haunts me every time I think about it. The fire that destroyed the library also preserved it. The intense heat baked many of the clay tablets hard enough to survive beneath the ruins for over 2,000 years. If Nineveh had not burned, much of Mesopotamian civilization might have dissolved into dust completely. Sometimes destruction becomes preservation. Centuries later, when archaeologists uncovered those buried tablets, entire worlds began speaking again. The Epic of Gilgamesh, flood traditions, the stories of Adapa, fragments of the Apkallu traditions, all surviving because someone in the ancient world believed memory mattered enough to preserve. But the chain did not stop there. After Mesopotamia's political power faded, later civilizations carried fragments of its wisdom forward under new names, new languages, new empires. One figure who fascinates me deeply is Berossus, the Babylonian priest writing during the Hellenistic period after Alexander's conquests transformed the ancient Near East. Berossus wrote in Greek, not Akkadian, attempting to preserve Babylonian history and sacred traditions for a changing world already forgetting its oldest roots. His original works are lost now, another tragedy in humanity's endless war against forgetting, but fragments survived through later Greek and Roman writers. And through those fragments, the memory of Oannes, the fish-cloaked sage emerging from the sea, survived into the classical world. Think about that for a moment. A Mesopotamian memory traveling through Greek language into later civilizations, centuries after the original culture itself had faded. The thread continued. Then came the great intellectual flowering of the Islamic Golden Age, another period that astonishes me more the deeper I study it. While parts of Europe descended into fragmentation after the fall of Rome, scholars across the Islamic world gathered, translated, preserved, and expanded ancient knowledge from Greece, Persia, India, and Mesopotamia. Figures like al-Biruni, one of the greatest scholars in human history, approached ancient civilizations with extraordinary curiosity and precision. He studied astronomy, mathematics, chronology, comparative religion, preserving fragments of older worlds while building new knowledge from them. And then there was Avicenna, Ibn Sina, philosopher, physician, polymath, whose medical and philosophical works shaped both the Islamic world and medieval Europe for centuries afterward. Sometimes I sit quietly thinking about these chains of transmission: Mesopotamian tablets copied by Assyrian scribes, fragments preserved through Greek historians, translated into Arabic, studied in Persian courts, later entering Europe through Spain and Sicily during the Middle Ages. Ancient wisdom surviving empire after empire, language after language, civilization after civilization. Even the Renaissance itself, often imagined as a sudden awakening of Europe, depended heavily on knowledge preserved through these earlier transmission networks. Astronomy, mathematics, philosophy, medicine, so much of what later transformed the modern world survived because people in distant centuries chose preservation over forgetting. And honestly, the emotional weight of that realization affects me deeply sometimes, because when we speak about civilization, we often focus on conquest, kings, monuments, wars, but perhaps the true builders of civilization were the preservers, the scribes, translators, librarians, scholars, quiet human beings who carried memory through darkness while worlds changed around them. Maybe that is the real legacy of the sages, after all, not supernatural powers, but transmission itself. The refusal to let knowledge die completely. The older I become, the more sacred that feels to me, because every civilization is fragile, every library vulnerable, every language temporary, and yet, somehow, across floods, invasions, collapsing empires, and burning cities, humanity kept carrying fragments forward, a line of memory stretching from the temples of Sumer all the way into the modern world. And perhaps that is why the stories of the Apkallu still matter, because in a strange way, they never truly disappeared. Their memories survived through the people who refused to let the ancient world fall entirely silent. At a certain point, somewhere between the flood myths of Mesopotamia, the seven sages of India, the watchers of Enoch, and the primordial rulers of Egypt, I stopped feeling like I was studying separate stories entirely. And honestly, that realization unsettled me more than any single myth ever did, because the deeper I went into these traditions, the less they felt isolated, and the more they began to resemble fragments of the same ancient human memory, repeated across civilizations in different languages, under different skies, through different symbols, but carrying the same emotional structure underneath. Again and again, humanity tells itself stories about teachers who arrive near the beginning of civilization, wisdom bearers, culture bringers, sacred intermediaries standing between ordinary humanity and some higher source of knowledge. In Mesopotamia, the Apkallu emerge from the waters of the Abzu, carrying writing, astronomy, mathematics, and sacred order. In India, the Saptarishi preserve cosmic wisdom and divine sciences. In Enoch, the Watchers descend with forbidden knowledge from heaven. In Egypt, the Shemsu Hor rule before dynastic kingship begins. Different civilizations, same pattern. And eventually, I found myself asking a question I could no longer avoid. Why does humanity keep retelling this story? Why do so many cultures instinctively imagine civilization beginning not through isolated human invention, but through transmission from enlightened figures standing beyond ordinary society? Part of the answer may lie deep inside the human mind itself. Psychologists often speak about archetypes, recurring symbolic patterns emerging across cultures because they reflect something fundamental about human consciousness. The wise old man, the divine teacher, the culture hero. These figures appear almost everywhere humans tell stories. Perhaps the sages survive because humanity naturally projects wisdom into symbolic forms, embodying abstract knowledge in memorable characters that future generations can preserve through myth. And honestly, I think there is truth in that explanation, because stories are how human beings organize memory emotionally, especially memory too large, too ancient, or too sacred to preserve as ordinary history alone. But at the same time, I cannot shake the feeling that something deeper is happening here too. Because these traditions are not merely random stories about wise people, they are specifically stories about civilization bringers, figures associated with the sudden emergence of ordered human society, writing, astronomy, architecture, sacred law, mathematics, medicine, agriculture, the very foundations of civilization itself. And perhaps that reflects another profound human instinct, the psychological need for origins. Human beings are not satisfied simply knowing that civilization exists. We want to understand where it came from, why it appeared, what force transformed scattered survival into cities, temples, sciences, and memory preserved across generations. Ancient cultures answered that question not with economic theories or evolutionary diagrams, but with sacred narratives. They imagined wisdom descending into the world through teachers because civilization itself felt miraculous to them. And honestly, maybe it still should feel miraculous to us too. Sometimes I think modern people underestimate how strange civilization really is. We are born into systems of knowledge so immense, language, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, engineering, that we rarely stop to consider how impossible they would seem to a solitary human being starting from nothing. Civilization is inheritance. Every generation receives worlds of accumulated memory from those who came before. In that sense, perhaps the ancient myths were never entirely wrong. We really were taught not by supernatural fish beings necessarily, but by countless generations of teachers, sages, observers, and preservers stretching backward into deep time. Maybe the Apkallu symbolize that reality emotionally, the endless chain of transmission carrying knowledge across catastrophes and centuries. But still, even after telling myself all this, I cannot fully dismiss the uncanny similarities between these traditions, because the parallels feel too structured, too emotionally precise, especially surrounding floods, primordial teachers, sacred sciences, and civilizations rebuilding after catastrophe. Sometimes late at night, after hours spent reading ancient texts from completely different cultures, I feel a strange sensation difficult to describe, as though humanity has been circling the same forgotten memory for thousands of years without ever fully recovering it. Different civilizations preserving different fragments, none complete on their own, all carrying echoes of something older. And perhaps that is why these stories endure, not because they provide certainty, but because they express a feeling humanity has never escaped. The feeling that civilization came from somewhere deeper than ordinary survival alone. A longing for origins, for connection, for continuity with a wisdom greater than ourselves. The deeper I went into these stories, the less they felt separate. Mesopotamian sages, Egyptian divine rulers, Indian seers, heavenly watchers, they began blending together into variations of the same ancient intuition. That knowledge is sacred, for I sake that civilization is fragile, and that humanity once stood closer to the source of wisdom than we do now. Maybe that is only mythology, maybe it is psychology, or maybe somewhere beneath all the symbolism, myths preserve emotional truths history alone cannot fully contain. Because myths are not merely false stories, they are memory shaped by meaning. Memory compressed into symbols, powerful enough to survive thousands of years after the civilizations that created them have vanished. And perhaps that is why humanity keeps retelling this story, because deep down, we are still trying to remember where the light first came from. By the time I reached the end of this journey, after following the 7 sages through Mesopotamia, after descending into flood myths, lost coastlines, buried libraries, heavenly watchers, primordial kings, and civilizations haunted by memories older than history itself, I realized something important had changed inside me. I no longer saw these stories as isolated myths competing against modern science, nor as simplistic proof of ancient aliens or supernatural intervention. The deeper I went, the less interested I became in choosing between literal belief and total dismissal. Because honestly, I think that approach misses the real mystery entirely. The true mystery is not whether fish-cloaked sages literally emerged from the sea, or whether heavenly beings physically descended onto mountains before the flood. The true mystery is why humanity has carried these memories for thousands upon thousands of years, across collapsing empires, changing religions, disappearing languages, and entire civilizations swallowed by time. Why did these patterns survive? Why did people preserve them with such emotional intensity? And slowly, almost reluctantly, I began feeling that perhaps the ancient world was trying to preserve something much deeper than simple historical events. Not precise facts, but memory itself, civilizational memory, emotional memory, sacred memory. Because maybe civilization did not begin only with invention, maybe it also began with inheritance. Think about it carefully. Every human being enters a world already shaped by knowledge accumulated before their birth: language, mathematics, astronomy, architecture, medicine, philosophy, all inherited. None of us creates civilization alone, we receive it. And perhaps the ancient myths were humanity's earliest attempt to express that profound truth, that wisdom comes to us through transmission, through memory carried across generations, through teachers, sages, survivors, and civilizations refusing to let knowledge die. The Apkallu, the Saptarishi, the Watchers, the Shemsu-Hor, maybe they represent different cultural ways of describing the same terrifying realization that human civilization is built upon fragile chains of memory stretching backward into forgotten ages. Chains that can break. Chains nearly lost through floods, wars, collapse, and time itself. And honestly, the older I become, the more sacred that feels to me. Because when you look at history carefully, civilizations do not survive because they are powerful. They survive because somebody remembers enough to rebuild after disaster. Somebody preserves the stories, the mathematics, the star charts, the rituals, the language, the wisdom. Somebody carries the memory forward through darkness into the next age. Maybe that is why the flood myths mattered so much, because ancient people understood how close humanity always stands to forgetting. One catastrophe, one collapse, one burning library, and entire worlds can disappear. We modern people often assume our civilization is permanent because our technology feels advanced, but the ancient world whispers a quieter warning across the centuries. Everything can vanish faster than you think. And perhaps that is why ancient cultures became obsessed with sacred transmission. Temple schools, buried tablets, oral traditions, libraries, scribes, initiations, all of them were attempts to resist oblivion, attempts to ensure memory survived long enough for civilization to continue. Sometimes late at night, when I think about the sages now, I no longer imagine them as literal supernatural beings standing apart from humanity. Instead, I imagine them as symbols of continuity itself, embodiments of the ancient human instinct to preserve wisdom against time, against catastrophe, against forgetting. The sages become every teacher who passed knowledge to the next generation, every scribe who copied a fading text, every survivor who carried memory across the ruins of a fallen world. And perhaps somewhere beneath all the myths, there really were forgotten civilizations, drowned coastlines, catastrophes so ancient they survived only as distorted memory. Perhaps fragments of lost knowledge truly did pass into later societies through survivors rebuilding after collapse. We may never know completely. But strangely, I think uncertainty itself is part of the point. Because myths were never designed to function like modern history textbooks. Myths preserve emotional truths, truths too large, too sacred, or too traumatic to survive as ordinary facts alone. They compress memory into symbols powerful enough to cross thousands of years. And maybe that is why these stories still affect us now, because deep down, modern humanity senses the same fragility ancient people sensed. We too fear collapse, fragmentation, forgetting, the possibility that everything we build could someday become ruins, studied by distant descendants trying to reconstruct who we were. The more I reflect on all of this, the more one thought keeps returning quietly to me. Maybe civilization itself is not humanity's greatest achievement. Maybe memory is. Because without memory, every generation begins again in darkness. And perhaps that is the final secret hidden inside the stories of the sages. Not proof of aliens, not proof of gods walking the earth, but a reminder that wisdom survives only when human beings choose to carry it forward. Maybe the ancients were not asking us to worship the sages. Maybe they were begging us not to forget them.